Hello, I'm Christy Hay, and this is Honoring and Integrating the Exiled Feminine in Psychedelic Spaces, responding to a disenchanted world of polarization. I'll start here with an excerpt from Terence McKenna's book, Food of the Gods. Sadly, the Western tradition has suffered a long sustained break with the socio-symbiotic relationship to the feminine and the mysteries of organic life that could be realized through the shamanic use of hallucinogenic plants. A bit of my own journey and what I consider coming home, as I've been able to do a lot of healing towards an emerging feminine perspective integrating within a masculine paradigm. Starting at the age of 18 and spanning 20 years, I engaged in occasional non focused, masculine, disenchanted, and recreational use. After a break from psychedelics during a time of increased anxiety and depression, I returned to use just over 2 years ago through intentional practices for my own mental health, grief support, and spiritual enchanted purposes, and in doing so, rediscovering the feminine. My practice accelerated in January 2025 when I spent 8 days visiting Eleuthenia Retreat in Mexico, experiencing and educated in mindful use of psilocybin and DMT. The picture to the right and all pictures in this presentation are from that retreat and Mexico City, where we flew in for the retreat. Since that time, I've been engaged in personal exploration and connection to the feminine with support from my partner, local guides, friends, and online groups. And to accommodate my therapy practice and support clients in this healing, I spent 6 months in a psychedelic harm reduction and integration certification program through Fluence Training. In just 2 weeks, I will fly back to Mexico City and Valle de Bravo for another 7-day retreat to continue my integration and healing practices. So this is Josefina, the curandera at Eleuthenia, or a traditional folk healer or medicine woman who treats physical, emotional, and spiritual illnesses. Josefina guided me as I grappled with my own emerging feminine aspects while at my first psychedelic retreat, providing comfort, gentle touch, and nurturance, especially in regards to connection with my body, moving me towards integrating my more masculine tendencies of control and achievement. Since this retreat, my relational abilities of presence and attunement to my husband, other relationships, and my clients have been drastically altered for the better. As someone who previously gendered and threw out concepts of masculine and feminine, I have been able to see beyond the gendering of these words and how they actually translate into modes of being. Pacifica graduate Dr. Lorraine Carisco states, "Some people have suggested that masculine and feminine should just be thrown out altogether because they're so latent and complex. I think they're too big and too important that they can't be thrown out. We have to grapple with them, and we have to understand what is the deeper story that's going on before we can free ourselves from just acting out what we've been acting out for a long time." This presentation aims to question if the psychedelic renaissance is genuinely integrating the feminine, or has it primarily adopted feminine symbolism while leaving patriarchal structures largely intact. The use of the feminine is not about gender as we typically understand it. It is about specific frequency of consciousness and epistemology that has been systematically starved. Instead of emphasizing women, these words describe qualities historically associated with the feminine archetype. Many of these words stand in contrast to the modern emphasis on mastery, control, extraction, certainty, and domination. For a further look into dimensions of consciousness, we have the dimensions of time, body and earth, healing, and beliefs, whereas the disenchanted world is linear and progress oriented, consumed and commodified, fixed on peak experiences, and rigid and top down, whereas the relational is cyclical and rhythmic, revered and powerful, focused on repair through relationship, and relaxed, emergent, and bottom up. So, in modern therapeutic and cultural frameworks, relational and somatic nodes of knowing are rarely integrated, instead pushed to the margins, commodified as aesthetic or pathologized as unstable. I've included this picture of my friend Mickey, who attended the retreat with me. She is posing next to a Frida Kahlo statue near Frida's birthplace of Coyoacan, inside of Mexico City. I recently watched the movie Frida and was struck by the archetypal material. Within Jungian and symbolic frameworks, Frida Kahlo has become a cultural image through which many qualities historically associated with the feminine, embodiment, suffering, relationality, intuition, and cyclical transformation, are expressed. Diego Rivera, by contrast, as I see him, symbolizes values associated with the modern masculine, including public action, monumentality, political agency, and rational organization. Their relationship can therefore be read as a symbolic dialogue between the complementary modes of consciousness, rather than simply between a woman and a man. As we have learned in our PRC coursework so far, the architecture of the disenchanted consciousness manifests in ecological destruction, cultural appropriation, misogyny, consumerism, commodified healing, projection of the feared and exiled feminine, restrictive systems for accessing support. Even in Oregon, the first state to legalize psilocybin for mental health purposes, the cost of access and regulations set forth by OHA have already led to service centers closing due to exorbitant licensing fees and is only affordable to those with a few $1,000s to spare. As I see it, healing within this structure often just reinforces the structure. Here we are engaging with the symbolic feminine rather than making claims about biological sex or essential gender. There is a surprisingly rich vocabulary across psychedelic traditions, ecology, mythology, and depth psychology. These metaphors are culturally situated, and many are indigenous or religious metaphors that should be distinguished from Jungian or contemporary Western psychological interpretations. In addition, nature is frequently feminized through language, often overlapping with developmental psychology. Some of the words here are Mother Nature, womb of the earth, living earth, fertile ground or fertility, bloom, flowering, fruiting, rootedness. In regards to nature and plant medicine, both our symbols and language often evoke the feminine. Here on the left are the egg basket chairs at Eleusinia, a place where one can feel cradled and held while swinging during a journey. These life-giving images listed here appear in the work of Stanislav Grof, though Grof treats them as transpersonal experiential motifs rather than exclusively feminine. He seems to avoid altogether the use of the word feminine and, perhaps as part of his own shadow, minimally comments on the incredible influence of his wife Christina and her work with him in development of his concepts and practices. All of these words are seen and used as part of the perinatal birth reenactments, the birth matrices. So over 20 years ago, one of the original MDMA researchers, Requa Tolbert, wrote, "With rare exceptions, consciousness researchers investigating psychedelic medicines are men with MDs and PhDs, psychiatrists, medicinal chemists, rat psychologists, and neuroscientists working to further legitimize use of these agents in a repressive social and legal climate. Clinical research today means university affiliation, nonprofit status, legal permission, ethics committees, FDA and DEA control, fundraising, and above all, of a specific pathology to treat." An article by Lucid News in 2020 reported that in looking at 7 psychedelic conferences and over 400 speakers, 2/3 of the speakers were male presenting and 98% of them were white. While more modern psychedelic science and training increasingly values the indigenous perspective, relationality, embodiment, and integration, some of these qualities long associated with the feminine, we are continuing to frame them within medicalized or technocratic paradigms. The container for psychedelic facilitation is created through set and setting, and this is not easily found in a Western research lab. The following words are often used by psychedelic practitioners describing ideal facilitation historically coded as feminine. So I have starred the word weaving at the bottom because it has been especially prevalent in my noticing and reading as of late and appeared many, many times in Françoise Borzat's book, Consciousness Medicine. I really admired her book, yet on early reading, I made the connection to her in a podcast I listened to last year called Power Trip, of New York Magazine's podcast Cover Story. In the podcast, references to sexual misconduct allegations against Borzat and her husband were highlighted. In reading her book, I attempted to maintain an objective view, but the conflict was still present within me by the end, and I wanted to understand more. This led me to discovering an article published last year titled Wolves Among Sheep, Sexual Violations in Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy from the American Journal of Bioethics. So some of the statements from that article is that above-ground clinical trial settings for psychedelic-assisted therapy have not been immune to sexual misconduct. So sexual violations represent an underappreciated risk, overshadowed by the predominant focus on medical risks. These relationships draw on the inherent power dynamic or imbalance between therapist and client. One former victim expressed concerns that psychedelic exceptionalism and the urgency to legalize psychedelics may be causing further harm. Grossbard and Borzat have denied all allegations, yet multiple accounts have been substantiated consistently by a community of survivors and vetted by leading news organizations. And the conclusion of this article, they state that power is meant to be wielded in service and protection of others, challenging societal norms and highlighting ethical responsibility. I do see the allegations against her and many of the other practitioners listed in the article as a result of the feminine being exiled to the shadows within our society. So practices can lose their meaning when deprived of their cultural container. We must expand this container by creating bridges to modern context. As we learned last week in class, assimilation, or here I see it as masculine, is fitting the visionary experience into old rigid structures. whereas accommodation of the exiled feminine means changing the underlying structure to hold the new reality. So if we simply soften beliefs without the ethical container, it does not restore the feminine. It merely creates new vulnerabilities for the disenchanted ego to exploit. Therefore, ethical containers that acknowledge the exiled feminine are required for this new reality. So while the feminine does not exclusively mean highlighting and including more women, in an interview with Dr. Devon Christie, she highlighted that this is reflected across the industry with the underrepresentation of women in leadership roles and a lack of recognition for women's contributions to the field, noting that embracing equity for women within psychedelics is essential. In Western biomedicine, men who have dominated positions within academic institutions have received the funding, accolades, and credit for bringing about the psychedelic renaissance. Yet, historically, in indigenous communities, it was often the women shamans who heavily influenced the healing practices that have influenced modern psychedelic research. So the deeper issue here is how women's bodies, voices, expertise, safety concerns, cultural identities, and epistemology shape the research questions, protocols, and interpretive frameworks within the Western masculine dominant system. The bridge is true integration, turning feminine aspects into ethical practices. This means increased presence and training of guides who embody the feminine, integration of peak experiences into understanding of the feminine through attention, presence, embodiment, relationality over hierarchy, connection practices to body, mind, spirit, earth, and cosmos, cultural attention, honor, and acknowledgement awareness of shadowed elements of the feminine, integration and accommodation of the exiled feminine to enhance ethical standards for practice into masculine Western structures. Integration is not merely remembering or having a peak experience, it is the rigorous practice of structural accommodation required to cross the bridge without falling into the shadow. From archetypal slogan to embodied living, the task is not to bring back the feminine as a vague archetype. It is to cultivate forms of consciousness capable of relation, reciprocity, eros, accountability, and ecological kinship. And I'll close with one of my favorite songs about being wild.